Welcome to Codebusters, Codebusters B and C for the Georgia Tech Event Workshop Series 24-25. And yeah, let's do this. All right, a little bit about me and a little bit about the workshop. So, hi, I'm Kleb. I'm a senior at the University of Illinois, and I'm studying math and secondary education. And I used to compete back in 2014 to 2021 with Hopkins Junior High School and then eventually Mission San Jose High School over in Northern California. I've been volunteering since then. So since my senior year, I've been volunteering and ESing, and a very, very big chunk of that has been Codebusters. So I'm very excited to share with you a bit about what I've learned in the past 7-8 years of this event. Okay, if you were present for, if you have read or watched or better yet, were present at the Sierra Vista or UT workshops from last year, this will be sort of similar, at least in flavor. There's some overlapping content. There's a bit of new stuff as well, but there will be some stuff that's repeated. Don't worry, I think you'll get something out of it regardless. Okay. All right, quick rundown of the agenda. We'll talk about rules very quickly, very briefly. Then we'll go kind of from small to big. So we'll start with micro strategies. This is like question to question, cipher to cipher type of strategy. We'll go a little bit bigger to macro strategy, which is looking at test to test kind of strategies, like looking at a test as a whole unit. And then we'll look at kind of across your entire season, how do you learn, how do you improve over time. And then lastly, I'll go over a couple quick links and resources. Okay, what's in the rules? Here's the cipher list for the year. Aristocrats, Patristocrats, Spanish aristocrats, or Xenocrypts, Baconian, Fractionated Morse, Cryptorhythm, Porta, Complete Columnar, Nihilist, Hill, which is Division C only, Affine, Apache, Caesar, which is Division B only. I'm not going to go over how these ciphers work today mechanically. I trust that you can Google it and find it out for yourself. That's not the point of today's workshop. Right? There are many sources out there that can explain it far better than I could, so go find them. They're everywhere online. Okay, a little bit more about the rules though. So the time question, if you solve it within 10 minutes, that's the first question on the test usually, you'll receive a bonus in addition to however many points the question is already worth. That bonus is 2 times 600, which is 10 minutes, minus the amount of time you took. So it's the amount of time left out of 10 minutes. Up to 3 questions will be marked as special bonus. These are worth, if you solve 1, it's 150. If you solve 2, you get 400. Solve 3, 750. Pretty big bonuses. These are for questions that are not aristocrats, patristocrats, or Xenocrypt. You'll usually see them on stuff like Baconian, Nihilist, Cryptorhythms, Fractionated Morse. Those are usually the most common ciphers for it. Scoring. For each question, if you're within 2, so within 2 letters, you will get full credit. Every error over 2 is a 100-point penalty. That should, yeah, down to 0. So if a question's worth 250 points and you get 5 errors, that's a 0, not negative 50. Cryptorhythms and key extraction, which is the Division C like K alphabet key extraction, they don't have this buffer, so you have to get every single character right to actually get full credit for those. Those answers are quite short, so that's the reason for that. Materials wise, I'm just going to point out, please make sure you have a 4 or 5 function calculator. I have had so many teams where I've had to like confiscate calculators because, or I've had to have people put calculators away because they're scientific or graphing or something. So just make sure you have a 4 or 5 function calculator, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and then maybe percent or square root or something. Okay, memory functions usually don't count. That's it. That's all I'm gonna talk about rules wise. Please go read them yourself, and the rules manual is available online for free. So please read them yourself for all the details. I'm not going to go into it. That's not the point of today. All right. I want to quickly run through a tiny bit of vocabulary, just in case, just because I will probably use these words automatically. I'll try to make it more user-friendly, but just so we're all on the same page. Okay. Plain text is the original message that you're encoding or that will be encoded. Usually you can read it and it makes sense. Ciphertext is, well, what happens after you encode it. So you encode plain text to get ciphertext, you decode ciphertext to get plain text. I know some people say decrypt and encrypt, but it's a little weird to say that in the context of classical cryptography. Anyway, that's a debate for another day. A cipher is the process by which you encode or decode. So it's how you get from plain text to ciphertext and ciphertext back to plain text. Okay, I tend to think of ciphers as the mechanism. You'll hear me, there's a reason I tend to say question or problem instead of cipher to denote each question on the test. A key is simply information that's used in the encoding process along with the cipher. So the cipher is a mechanism. The key is something you add to your plain text to get the specific ciphertext you want, and vice versa. Okay. Last thing, monoalphabetic and polyalphabetic. A monoalphabetic cipher is simply a cipher that in which each plaintext letter always encodes the same ciphertext letter. So if within, assuming you use the same key and all that, right? So, assuming you use the same, like within the same question or problem. So, for example, if A encodes to C, then A always encodes to C in that case. If B encodes to F, then B always encodes to F. Polyalphabetic usually just means that that's not the case, and it'll depend on some extra information. Okay. That's all the basics. Oops. So let's talk micro strategies. By the way, if you have questions, please hold them to the end. Again, we're starting a bit late, so I'm gonna blitz through this as quickly as I want to try to make sure we get through this so we have time for Q&A. I haven't seen any questions, so just for the future. All right, let's talk micro strategy. First and foremost, aristocrats are number one. Aristocrats, that's your like typical encoding letter for letter, often randomly or seemingly randomly. Okay. Aristocrats are the most fundamental cipher in all of Codebusters. Okay. In fact, I believe that no matter what role you play on your team, you should be proficient at aristocrats. Why is that? Well, first of all, it's like 30% of your test plus time question. It's a lot of points. It's it's a very, very big chunk of the points that you can possibly earn. And the other thing that's really important about them is that the skills you learn from getting good at aristocrats transfer to every other cipher. I know this says other cipher. I mean like every other cipher, literally. And you'll see why as I talk more about how I approach aristocrats. But I'm just going to start with this and say, if you're like on a team and like other people do aristocrats, you should also be doing aristocrats to an extent. Maybe less than other people, but you should still be doing them. Okay. So when we're solving an aristocrat, I tend to think of it in 3 phases. The first is the break-in. This is like the first observation you make. Maybe it's a word or a specific couple of letters or something that you use to start your solve. Next is the aha moments, or the ahas, which are kind of the observations you make based on your break-ins. These are also observations that give you lots of information all at once, and they're usually spread out throughout the cipher or throughout the ciphertext in different places. Finally is the fill-in process. This is once you've gotten like a skeleton of like what your plain text is sort of going to look like, the fill-in process is actually writing in all the letters you already know and the letters that you can. So it's writing in the letters that you do know, and writing in the letters that don't appear often enough for you to for that to have mattered in the rest of your solve so far. Okay. Now, here's why I make this distinction, which is Break-in and aha are more difficult, but they're also very fast, right? A break-in is like one observation. It's like one word at most, maybe a couple words, and you write them in, and then that's it. Fill-in process takes a lot of time. You're filling in a lot of letters. Oftentimes, you have to match them to what letters you already have decoded. So fill-in takes time, but break-in and aha is something you can train to be very fast. And assuming you can actually like spot it right away, the execution is very quick. And I make that distinction for a reason. Okay, let's keep going. Frequency is overrated. So as an event supervisor, frequency, using letter frequencies is extremely overrated in my opinion. And I know that because I see so many incomplete aristocrats that have just like E and T filled in. Okay, so here's my alternative for you. And what you should do to solve aristocrats instead of looking at frequency. Okay. Aristocrats I think of on 4 levels. There's letters, which is sort of what I just mentioned, right? You're filling in all the T's and E's and whatever, ETAOIN. Maybe you know that. Maybe you know your frequency super well. And that's great. But there is a lot more you can think about. For example, letter combinations. Those are parts of words. TION endings, ING ending, the mente ending in Spanish. These are all things that you can look for that you can give you multiple letters at a time. Words, especially word patterns. And by word patterns, I mean, for example, in the word people, the P is repeated and the E is repeated, and it's 6 letters long, right? So noting where those repeated letters are in your in those words, that's what I mean by word pattern. So if you can spot word patterns like people, nothing, that, and so on, you can get a whole word at a time. And then even bigger is phrases. For example, this phrase is actually quite recognizable. You see the first 2 words have the same, start with the same letter. It's 3, then 2, then 3 letters long. And then the E is shared in the 2 3-letter words. So you can possibly spot that and fill in one of the all at once. And that's, it's 8 letters all at once. So grammatical pieces is this sort of like biggest level you can think about an aristocrat at. And in general, my advice to you is think big. I think too many people get caught up on letter by letter kind of solving, but if you ask anyone who's done this event with a lot of experience, who's maybe done quite well in the event, they'll probably tell you that word patterns are your best friend, especially for breaking in. If you can get and the reason is, it's a lot of information all at once. That is 3 letters, right? 3 unique letters. People is 4, P, E, O, and L, right? Nothing is even more, right? If you can recognize word patterns or phrase patterns, you will get a lot of information right away. And so that will speed up your solving quite a bit. And that will speed up your solving quite a bit. And also, they tend to be very, once you get good at it or very like comfortable with it, they become easier to spot. Okay. Filling in kind of is related to that. If you think about phrases and sentences and words instead of letter by letter, filling in can go a lot faster because you can kind of predict what the next word is, right? So just kind of be thinking about like, okay, what am I writing down and does it make sense? Okay. Ahas, same idea. Does the word that I'm guessing in this spot actually make sense in context? Okay. So letter frequency, in my opinion, is very overrated. And I see that because I say that because I've seen hundreds of teams do this event, and so many teams fill in E's and T's and stuff without actually getting much else. Don't over rely on letter frequency. It's a useful tool, but that's it. It's just a tool. Okay. Let me expand a little bit on what I mean by words and phrases, and talk a little bit about grammar. Okay. Languages have rules. And that sounds like an obvious statement, but like really think about that for a second, right? English has certain rules that, assuming you are a native English speaker, you probably know them super well by now, and you never really like stop to think about, okay, what rules does English actually have, right? Okay, for example, parts of speech can only appear in certain parts of a sentence. In English, it's very rare to have a noun than another noun. Instead, it's much more common to have a noun than a verb, or something like that, right? Subject, predicate. So you can sort of think about things in that way. I'll give you one explicit example, and that's 2021 GGSO number 13. The slides, this is a public test if you want to go find it. And the and it's linked on the slides when we send those out. So anyway, I'm just going to tell you and say that the point was it was a patristocrat where the hint was that it was a location of an object. So this was 2021, so I was competing then. Uh, what I did to solve that question was I literally guessed prepositions at the beginning until one worked. So I guessed below, in front of, next to, stuff like that. And eventually one of them worked. I'm not going to spoil it, but that's how I actually solved it, which is just thinking about what parts of speech are possible in that sentence. Part of it was that the ciphertext was very short. So I was like, okay, this might not be a full sentence. So that was part of the reason. But yeah, it's a very real strategy. Okay. Next up, small rules like subject-verb agreement, right? You wouldn't say he are, you'd say he is or he was, right? You wouldn't say they is, you'd say they are or they were. So that will give you a lot of information. Are versus is, for example, or if you can tell that if you can tell something says, for example, are the, then you know that the before it is probably an S because it's a plural noun. So just kind of keep that in mind. Okay. Punctuation as well. So you can get conjunctions and, or, but, so on, as well as contractions like don't, or won't, or doesn't, or didn't, right? Those are instant indicators of like, hey, something to examine here, right? You see a bunch of words, comma, a bunch of words. Maybe look at that first word after the comma. Is that an and or an or something? I want to also point out that Spanish is like even better at this than English. English has a bunch of weird exceptions to all their rules. Spanish actually doesn't. Spanish is very regular, right? So here's my hint. Even if you're not a Spanish speaker, I bet you can still do Spanish to aristocrats if you learn how Spanish's grammar works. For example, what I mentioned earlier, mente, right? mente, that changes adjectives to adverbs. So if you know that rule, that will tell you a lot of information. Okay, most nouns have a gendered article before them, like un, la, las, los, etc. So if you know that, you can spot it, and it's actually quite easy to with some practice. Okay? Vocabulary is not that important for the Spanish aristocrats, right? And I'm saying that as someone who doesn't know much Spanish, to be honest. But if you have a very, 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 very basic vocabulary, and then just learn how the grammar works, because a lot of words are also very similar between the two languages. Okay, so I believe you can do this even if you're not a Spanish speaker. Okay. Okay, a few more miscellaneous cipher tips. First, patristocrats. I'm just gonna run through this really fast. Play aggressive. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a couple of minutes, what aggressive means, but just play aggressive on these. Get used to exploiting K alphabets. So for example, look for low frequency letters to get JK, PQ, VWXYZ, those types of things. This kind of goes for fractionated Morse as well, because the alphabet works the same way, where you can kind of you don't be afraid to make a guess. It's like, okay, I see a bunch of letters in a row. Let's just fill them in, or a bunch, like roughly what the letters should be. Okay. Last thing is scan the ciphertext first before you start it. This is something that like I didn't realize how important it was until I did it. But it's very, very important. It's very, very powerful. One of the best observations you can make is seeing the same three letters repeatedly and then just guessing the on it. THE. It's that simple, but it's very, very powerful. Okay. Baconian. First thing is stop writing A's and B's. I don't know how I didn't know this until after graduating. But like write dots and dashes or dots and slashes or something. It's so much faster than writing A's and B's. I cannot believe how much easier that is. Anyway, next tip. Remember that BB doesn't start any letter in Baconian. So if you have a B in the first one of the first two letters, the other one has to be an A. Or yeah. So if you have a B in one of the first two positions, the second one has to be an A. That'll help you. That actually is like the key deduction for a lot of Baconian problems. Okay, and just like before, think big picture. Is what I'm writing down making sense? Does flipping one of the bits, right? Does flipping one of my A's into a B, or I guess following my own advice, dots into a dash, does doing that make this make sense? That's usually what I'm thinking about. Okay, Hill and affine. Use negative numbers. I'm surprised at how many teams don't do this. Right? A through M is 0 through 12. N is 13. M, and then O is negative 12. It's not 14. Right? Then P is negative 11, and so on. That makes your arithmetic so much faster. I cannot, like, it's to the point where I don't even need a calculator a lot of times for Hill, because it is just that much faster. So if you aren't already doing that, make use of it. On the same, for a similar reason, especially for Hill, you'll see a lot of zeros and 13s sometimes. Remember, 13 times an even number is a multiple of 26, so you can just cancel it out. 13 times an odd number is 13, mod 26. So you don't have to do anything too crazy there. Okay. The other bit of advice is don't decode everything. You really don't have to, right? Just decode enough to where you can see what the answer is, right? In my experience, that's around 60%. You shouldn't need to decode more than around 60% of a Hill or affine. Affine maybe even less, because it has aristocrat rules. Some more miscellaneous cipher tips. We're gonna go kind of quick. Character rhythms. Use the answer line. I feel like this is I think this is somewhat obvious. I think most teams do this, but like just keep that in mind. Use the answer line to your advantage. For example, every word needs vowels. So if you're getting a bunch of consonants in one word, check if one of the vowels fits that number. Okay. Like with Baconian, or like with Hill, like with affine, you don't need to solve everything, right? I know it's like it feels nice to solve everything, but you really shouldn't have to. Okay. Also, if you haven't already, look up how to take square roots by hand, because these show up sometimes, and they're really fun. So I recommend it. Look up how to take square roots by hand. Okay, there are two cipher types that I'm not going to talk about, and I apologize if you have questions about them, but like, that's K3 keyword extraction for div-C and nihilist cryptanalysis. These two take a while to talk through, so I'm not going to talk about them today. Unironically, go to tobas.com/codebusters and read the like cipher guide. I'm not kidding. Like on the homepage, read the cipher. There's a cipher guide linked. Go read it for some work examples. They will explain it much better than I can, or much better than I can in like 3 minutes. So that's my advice for that. And then just practice them. Lastly, for complete columnar, this is also something I'm surprised teams don't do, is stack your columns. For example, if I have 8 columns, if I'm checking 8 columns like this, here's what you can do. If I want to check 4 columns instead, I read 1, 2. This is my first column. These 2 columns are my first column. I hope you guys can see this. I don't know how my cam looks. If you're looking at my camera, then you take your first two columns, read them together, then take your next two columns and read them together, columns 3 and 4, then 5, 6, then 7, 8. Those are your 4 columns in order. I was like shocked at how few teams do this. So just from like event supervising. So there's your helpful tip. If you aren't doing that already, try it out. You might get your mind blown. It's a really fun it's a really nice trick that saves a bunch of time. It'll cut your searching speed and sorry, it'll cut your search time in about half. Okay. I apologize if I'm talking too fast, by the way. I know we started a bit late, so we're gonna try to wrap up. All right, let's talk macro. So macro, I'm talking like on the test level instead of on the question level. Let's talk on the test level. First off, time question. Put 2 people on this thing, at least. All right. Some teams do 3-person setups. That can work. Some, especially a few, like I've actually learned that a few top teams do 1 person on timed. I don't recommend this simply because most of the time the reason they do that is they have 1 person who averages like 230 on an aristocrat, which is just not realistic for most people. Like my past team included. It's just like some people are just crazy, and if you have someone like that who can do that, go for it. I don't recommend it. So I recommend 2 people. Okay. And the main reason to have 2 people is actually to speed up fill-in. Remember, fill-in is slow, aha and break-in are fast, but difficult. So I recommend having multiple people specifically to speed up fill-in. And the way you do that is by writing at the same time. If you have 1 person on your team who's right-handed and 1 person on your team who's left-handed, that makes this much easier so you don't like, hit each other while writing. But, my team did 2 people who were right-handed and it worked. So, but yeah. And what you would do is kind of split the question in half and say, I'm going to write everything that's on the left-hand side. You're going to write everything that's on the right-hand side. I think I flipped that. But basically divide the question in half and like have a plan going in, like, okay, who's going to write where? Having 2 brains on the question is a secondary effect. It's nice, but the writing is actually the #1 thing, in my opinion. Okay. The other thing about time question is make sure to try to transition into the test as quickly as you can. And okay, and the idea is have 1 person look through the test while the others finish, right? If you're doing a 2-person setup already, it should just be your 3rd person. They should be looking through the test and kind of marking down on like which questions each person should be doing. And then as the time question is getting checked by the event supervisor, get started on something else, right? Don't be the team that like waits there watching the event supervisor check your question. Just let them do it. Don't worry about it. Okay. Okay. Now for the test itself. So we finished time question, hopefully. We now have like the next 25, 30-ish minutes, depending on how fast your time question is. Around half hour maybe. Should be on the test itself. Okay. So have a plan going in. Who's doing what cipher? Okay. And I'm not going to tell you or try to tell you what roles you should have, but I will give you an example. Okay. Also, be flexible. So like you should have a plan going in, but be prepared to change the plan depending on what the test has. Okay. Here's an example that I give that based on my old team. This was 2021. The ciphers were different, but this should hopefully give you an idea of how to plan these things. Okay. So we had 1 person who was on time question, did aristocrats, then Caesar, Alpha, and Apache, then anything else if time allowed. I was person 2 who do time question, then patristocrats, Baconian, Xenocrypt, then whatever else was available. I almost never had extra time, let's be honest. Person 3 started by scouting the test, then did Pollux and Morbid, which was the Morse code cipher at the time, then Visionaire, which is like Porta, then did other stuff, whatever was available. Okay, and he usually finished like with plenty of time to do other things. But that was our setup. And remember, that doesn't have to be your setup. In fact, it shouldn't, because half these ciphers don't exist anymore. But come up with a setup with like a flow of like, okay, I'm going to prioritize this, then this, then this, and do that, right? And then stick to it within reason, within the test. The other advice I have for during the test is have a shot caller, right? They should be the one who makes final decisions, the one who kind of like goes, okay, I see this cipher on this page. I'm going to hand you that sheet of paper so that way you can do that whenever you finish the previous one, right? It's just to make the flow more smooth, right? This isn't some power thing. It really shouldn't be, at least. It really is just about facilitating and making things run as smoothly as possible. Okay. Last thing about the test, keep your morale up, right? If something goes wrong, you can discuss that after the event is over. Don't do it during. If something goes wrong, all good, move on, okay? Right? You really, really, really don't want to like get frustrated during the test and then like crash and then just not be able to perform after that. Okay. All right. The last phase of the test, and I would say the final 15, maybe 10 minutes, is what I'd consider the end game. And during the end game, you should try and shift gears. And the reason is we're at a point now where you should be focusing on finishing individual questions, not doing the test in general. And I make that distinction because you only get points for finishing questions pretty much. Remember, you get 100 points off for starting at your third error. So if you make 6 errors, you're probably not getting any points on that question, right? So we're at a point now towards the end where you really should be focusing on trying to finish every question you can. Okay. Here's the example. If you end with 3 questions, each finish 60%, that's 0 points, usually. Okay. This is also where the shot caller is especially important, because they should be directing who's doing what and handing out papers and sorting papers like that. Okay. And again, you'll have to be ready to make adjustments because the speed at which you do stuff is variable. But if your team leader knows the team, sorry about that. If the team leader knows the team and knows what each person is capable of, they can delegate and make hopefully a decent finish. Okay. This is also a point where it's very common to team solve questions, kind of like time question, where like you'd have 2 or 3 people on the same question all writing at the same time. Remember, fill-in is slow. So if you need to speed that up towards the end, again, to make sure you finish questions, because they're at a point where, right, it's better to double up your skills and finish 1 question than not finish 2. I learned this the very hard way at GGSO 2021. I'm not going to talk about any more about that. Okay. Last thing is the next thing, be decisive. So it's okay if you make a bad call. Like if your team leader makes a bad call, that's okay. It's better to commit to it than half commit to what would theoretically be the correct call, because you're not finishing anything anyway. So you might as well just commit to it. And if it goes wrong, it goes wrong. But, just kind of keep that in mind. Make sure you have a unified vision of what's going on. Okay. This is also a time to play extra aggressive. And I've used that word twice now. So what does playing aggressive mean? Let me talk about this. Okay. So Codebusters tend to have 2 general schools of thought with regards to the approach to the event. The first is using deduction. That's solving step by step, using logical decisions at each step to almost always, making decisions that are almost sure. Meanwhile, the other way is using intuition, which is solving with assumptions and patterns and checking as you go. Now, I'm telling you to play aggressive, Okay, so I prefer intuition. And the reason to use intuition, and the reason I think, and also kind of the reason that it is scary, is that it's fast, but it's also high risk, right? So if you make a mistake, it will cost you because you lose a bunch of progress. But the thing about intuition is that if you can make a good guess, if your intuition is very strong, it's extremely fast, right? This is kind of like what we talked about with aristocrats, right? Where you can think about if you can guess whole words or whole phrases at the same time, it's so much faster than guessing letter by letter. Okay? So try your best to suppress the fear of being wrong. I know that's hard. I'm a pre-service math teacher. I know. It's hard. It's hard to suppress the fear of being wrong. I'm asking you to try. Okay? Make fast, bold guesses. Again, just like we talked about before, think about words instead of letters. And the other thing about playing with intuition is making sure you spot check and sanity check as you go. So once you fill in a word that you think might be right, check a couple of letters to make sure they match with the other stuff in the question. The other thing is, if you practice a lot, the intuition will come naturally. You will build intuition by practicing. And we'll talk about practice right at the end. Okay. Last thing on team things, communication. Okay. So communication should be frequent, clear, and positive. You will not believe how many times where I'm like supervising the event and the room is like dead silent. And that kind of freaks me out because it means that the teams aren't communicating with one another, which is kind of scary, right? You should all be independent, but you should all also be united in a vision about what you're doing to move forward. Okay. Like I mentioned before, you can always discuss what went wrong after the event's over. Don't worry about it during the event. Talk about that after. Okay. So frequent, clear, positive communication. Now, communication generally comes in three categories. Okay? Facilitation, which is test-wide strategy, finishing a question, which questions are on what page, things like that. Okay? The idea for this type of communication is to make sure we're all on the same page of what's done and what needs to be done by whom. Okay. Help. I forgot how a cipher works. Hey, I forgot what this Morse code thing is. What's the Baconian pattern for X again? That's what I mean by that. Okay. It's okay to ask those types of things, especially since, right? Especially if you're especially if you want to just like look at a word and like try to recognize what the word says. Next up, and last up is morale, right? Keep your team spirits high. I'm saying this again. Let all good be your motto. It's fine. You can talk about stuff later. Okay. All right. Last content thing, and then we'll get to resources and Q&A. So, fundamentals. How do you practice? If I were doing this in person, I would ask if any of you I would ask this to you all. What is Codebusters actually about? But I'm just gonna give you my answer. Codebusters isn't really about cryptography. I've taken a cryptography course here at U of I at the undergraduate level. Nothing like this. Okay. Here's what I really think Codebusters is about, and this is partially why I love it so much. It's about linguistics, right? We talked about rules in grammar, right? We talked about words and making sense of like what makes sense in the sentence that you're reading. Right? That's linguistics. That's what this really is. It's about pattern recognition, right? We talked about word patterns earlier, right? We talked about intuition based on your past experience. That's pattern recognition. It's about puzzle solving. That's what you're doing at the end of the day. And it's about strategy development. All those strategies I've been talking about and all the tips that we've been discussing through this whole workshop, those are things that we develop over time through practicing and through learning from one another. Okay. My conclusion from this, though, is that Codebusters is more about practice than it is about content, right? This isn't really a study event. It's closer to something like Write It, Do It, in fact. That's like much more practice-based or experimental design. Okay, so instead of thinking about what content you're learning, think about the skills you're building. You're learning how to recognize patterns and develop strategies and all that stuff. That's really what this is about. Okay, and I say that because, well, I think one piece of advice that we don't talk about enough is how do you actually practice? Because that's a big question. Okay, first thing is consistency. You should practice consistently. If you've learned an instrument or a new language or play a sport or something, you probably are aware of practicing a little bit regularly. For example, 30 minutes every day. I'd argue that this is more that doing half an hour every day is better than chunking those into like 1.5 hour practice sessions, or 2.5 or whatever, right? I'd argue that this is more useful, in my opinion. Okay. If you can do a little bit every day, you'll improve very quickly. Okay. With that said, long sessions are still useful, right? They can help you build endurance and they can help you work as a team better, right? If you're going to run through a test as if you're competing, that's still important. Also make time to also make time to develop strategies, right? Again, all those strategies I talked to you about before come from taking time to develop those strategies and come up with those things. Okay, scrimmaging, or scrims for short. Okay, if your school has multiple teams, scrim against each other, compete against each other, practice against each other, right? That little bit of competition helps drive you really easily. And also practice with and against your teammates, or even better, if you have a network around your school with other teams, right? If you can contact other teams and say, hey, do you want to practice? Do you want to scrim? Let's do it. Excuse me. Especially now with like a bunch of online communities, SciOly.org, for example, you can definitely you can actually find a lot of practice that way. Okay. The other thing is that within your team, I highly recommend you write tests for each other. Our practice regimen back when I was in high school very much was like we would each write each other a test that was like maybe 10 questions. It wasn't like a super long one. We'd each do it individually, and then we work on and then we do a team test every week. That was like our regimen back then. But like writing for each other is really powerful because it helps you generate a lot of questions. You don't remember, this is a practice event. You can generate infinite amounts of practice by just putting different words together. And trust me, you can find quote generators online. Just Google it. Okay. Online resources. For example, cryptograms or Puzzle Baron. In my opinion, it's great for learning early on. It's great for like a warm-up or to stay sharp throughout your season. Once you're past a certain point, it starts to give diminishing returns. So if you're new to the event or new-ish to the event, I highly recommend you do a lot of them. There comes a point where you probably should get weaned off of it, though. Just kind of keep that in mind. Right? Autofill is not going to help you in the long term. Autofill is something you're not going to have in the long term. So just keep that in mind. Okay. I think this is like the last thing. How do you actually learn new ciphers? Right? Maybe you're changing roles. Maybe it's the new year and you're learning new ciphers for the new year. Here's how I do it. Okay. First of all, read up on how it works. For example, on Decode. I'll have the link to this later. Okay. Then play around with an encoder or decoder. Especially use the one that's on Tobez because that's usually what people will write tests using. So use Tobez.com for your information for that. Okay. Work through one example in full detail, very slowly. This can take like a half hour. That's fine. Okay. It might be even worth it to go through an example already knowing what the answer is and just figuring out how you get to that answer. Okay. We do this in math a lot too. So like there's your free math tip of the day, I guess, if you want. Uh, after that, do a few practice questions. This is one of those things where you can have a partner write some for you, just like what I mentioned before. And then, okay, and that should be it. In general, you should spend more time doing and practicing the cipher and less time reading about the cipher. Trust me, you will learn the mechanics just from doing it. All right, resources. We made it. Let's go. Okay, so I'm linking Cryptogram's Puzzle Baron here. It's great. Tobez, which is the main site that most people use to generate or make tests. Decode is my favorite resource for like information about the ciphers themselves. Personally, decode.fr/tools list. If you get the French website for some reason, you might have to click around to find the English one. I think it should just take you there. And then small plug for my own user site on SciOly.org, user:/Kleb. I've supervised this event like 40 times at this point. So there are 20 something tests just on my user page alone that you can practice off of if you would like to. I'm like, I don't mean to like toot my own horn too much, but this is something I've put several years of my life into. So if you want a bunch of practice tests, go check my user page. I've written for like a couple dozen tournaments that are all publicly available. Otherwise, 99% of the time, if you want to find tests to do, which again, number one thing, write for each other, right? If you have partners, write for each other. If you have other teams, write for the other teams. But the other thing you can do is go look up, go to like the SciOly, go to like SciOlympiads page for like tournaments and what tournaments are coming up, and go to like the SOINC's, so SOINC. You can go to SOINC's page of invitationals and just look at which tournaments are going on, and you can check if they have tests available from this year. That's actually that I've found several test sets just from doing that. But again, it's Codebusters. You can use a quote generator and then just copy and paste stuff into Tobez, and it will be fine enough for you to practice. Okay. All right, thank you. Q&A time. All right, let's see. Resources, we just talked about this. Hello from California. We already talked about Puzzle Baron. Yeah, go to SciOly. Yes. Okay. I'll answer questions for a bit. Sorry to the next person, I guess. Div B, guideline of how many questions are within the test. No, it varies. You can look at past tests to see how long they are. I'd say in general, like 25 to 32 is like the standard for most, for Div B and Div C, honestly. So somewhere in there, probably. Maybe slightly shorter, depending on who's writing it. Patristocrats. We talked about this a little bit. It's really hard to give any like solid advice on patristocrats because they are just inherently so difficult. I recommend these are the tips I have for you today. A lot of patristocrats are a lot of patristocrats are keyed, so get comfortable with your K1, K2 alphabets especially. And I think just like I honestly think it's like get used to making good guesses and get used to making guesses, right? Don't be afraid of guessing, because that will actually get you very far. And then once you can break that mold, you will start to see patterns. So that's probably what I'd say. Percent of problems solved by top-ranked teams. I wouldn't even say percentage-wise that's a particularly good metric, will I think the actual answer to that is 100%, in that like if given infinite time, the top teams will eventually solve every question. But like, you're limited into 50 minutes, obviously. So I don't know, probably somewhere in the 20s, like raw questions done per test, somewhere in the 20s. But it depends so much on the questions themselves. Sometimes we just write tests that are really hard, or sometimes the test is just really easy. So I can't give you like an exact answer on that. Besides, in theory, it would be 100%. Though obviously that's not going to happen in practice. Keep going on questions. Hopefully admin will yell at me if I'm going too far, or if we're going too far over time. Let's get back to this part, by the way. Keep asking whatever questions you have. I mean, yeah. For Affine is an aristocrat. That's the real answer. But I would say like even for those, like Affine is technically an aristocrat. But even for stuff like that, or for Hill, or for like Baconian even, I would still encourage you to think more intuitively than you probably already are. Like for Affine, I mentioned before, right? You should really only be decoding like 60% of it at most. Affine even less because it's an aristocrat, right? So if you can get a few letters and then just like fill in the rest based on, oh, that's just what a word is, right? Then I think you can do that, and that will speed you up a lot. But I would agree that there's more of a mix for some of those ciphers, yeah. Good question. Pitch aristocrats by far. What ciphers usually have the most points? It'd be pitch aristocrats by far. Like it used to be a tradition that we would have a 600-point pitch aristocrat at every test. That's not the case anymore because no one solves them. But that used to be a tradition. But you'll usually see like pitch aristocrats being like 450 to 600. Bonus points are are in addition to single cipher points. Oh yeah, I forgot to talk about. Okay, let's address this first. 25 aristocrats daily. Do you think it's enough? I don't know. Everyone learns at a different pace. What I would say is you should hopefully is that you can possibly like keep track of your progress as you continue. Like maybe you do that for a couple weeks, and then you like do a test like with your team, and then you'll see how if you've improved as a team. That might be one way you can check if it's enough or not. But I don't really have a hard answer on that because everyone learns at different paces. Should we memorize Morse code or Baconian keys per letter? My answer, I would say you shouldn't have to, because if you practice them enough, you will memorize them just from doing it. That's what I would say on that. So no, but yes, eventually you probably will. The reference sheet is there to help you if you need it. I would say for Morse code and Baconian, usually you shouldn't need it if you've practiced them enough. I actually forgot to talk about that, so thank you for bringing that up. Okay, I know we're going super overtime. What other questions do we have? Otherwise, I'm going to end it because we need to let the next group in. Metric mastery is next. Okay. In that case, I think we're going to let metric mastery go.